class. Today's topic is pay and incentive systems. We're on chapter 11. This chapter obviously focuses a lot on money and the effective use of money, but I think it would be wise to start by saying it's important to bear in mind that there are other ways to motivate and shape behavior other than using pay. So don't underestimate the impact of non-financial rewards, things like recognition, appreciation, training, meaningful work. So recognizing employees for their contribution, showing appreciation for their work. Even some employees see training as a reward. So training shows that the company sees them as worthwhile enough of an employee to invest funds in. This employee is worthy enough that we want to expend funds, investing training funds in this person. So many employees see that as a sign that the company values them, and also it's building the intellectual skills or abilities that might make them more marketable in case there is a downturn with their present employer. And then certainly the meaningful work can be a motivator. I want to, at the same time, not understate the importance of money. It's a key way that we shape behavior in the U.S. and in many other global economies. So money is a key way that we shape behavior, so financial rewards. It's probably, in my opinion, is the key motivator in the workplace. It's not the only motivator, but it's a very important motivator. So it is incumbent on us to learn how to use the tool effectively, because it can be mismanaged. It can result in funds that are expended without that motivational effect that we're seeking. I think one of the key ways to use money effectively is to make sure it's used in an equitable fashion. So it's easy for perceptions of inequity to arise in the workplace for whatever reason, but particularly when we're talking about pay. Employees oftentimes are quick to feel that they've been mistreated if they find out that they're paid differently from a coworker or someone else that they compare their outcomes with. And oftentimes there are perfectly good reasons for those pay differences, but employees aren't always necessarily immensely open-minded to why they might be paid less than someone else they're comparing pay to. So we need to watch for perceptions of inequity and realize that these things do happen and seek to minimize those and seek to keep an open door so that employees will come to us, come forward and talk about these perceived inequities when they happen. So two key concepts related to equity are internal equity and external equity. Internal equity is when employees compare their pay or their bonuses, their pay outcomes to others within the company, whether it's an immediate coworker or somewhere else within the same organization. I think this happens a lot. We all know that there are organizations that try to enforce pay secrecy, where employees are told not to share their pay outcomes with others. I don't think these work very well. I am in favor of pay secrecy because I think when people compare pay, when two people compare pay, one person walks away unhappy. So personally, at a personal level, I try not to do this. I'm an equity sensitive, which means I'm pretty sensitive to perceived inequities, and I know that about myself. And I've found it's best if I don't try to go and get a lot of information on other people's outcomes, particularly regarding pay. And I think it's best for most employees too. But not all employees are going to take this attitude. They will compare pay, and it is problematic, but we know it happens. I think it happens quite a bit at blue-collar levels too. I found that blue-collar employees tend to compare pay with one another more, but it happens at all levels, and it, as I say, is potentially problematic. So let's assume it's going to happen, and let's be ready to explain our decisions to employees. So that's internal equity, comparing pay to others within the same organization. External equity, you can kind of see where that's headed. It's comparing pay to referent others, or these people that we have in our minds that we feel are good comparisons outside of the company. So maybe I'm a marketing manager, and I'm comparing my pay to what marketing managers in other companies make, whether in my region or in the U.S. as a whole. So people do that as well. They want to know, not only am I treated fairly within the company as compared to the other people that I should be earning more or less in my opinion, but people in similar positions in other companies. And employees definitely do these comparisons too. And sometimes they don't, the comparators that they pick to compare to aren't realistic. So there are differences in cost of living in other locations. There are differences in skill sets that do factor in, and employees aren't always aware of these influences on pay that may make their pay look a little bit lower than their comparators that they have chosen. I've run into this in the past, and it may take a fair amount of explanation to employees so that they understand these things. And again, they're not always the most open-minded, so these other influences do affect how those comparisons come out. I think that Cascio introduces a figure that is quite important, the traditional job-based compensation model. Why don't we put that on the screen here for a moment and get you to consider this model, maybe look through the different steps in that process. You can see this is a pretty systematic, almost a, I don't want to say a scientific process, but it's a very refined process. I've done this, excuse me, I have done this in organizations before. It's a pretty tried and true method for determining pay, determining which occupations earn what the different levels of pay are between occupations. So this has been done for a long time. It's systematic. It's pretty defensible. So it is an option for you if you work in an organization that feels like they don't have a defensible system, they don't have a solid system for determining who earns what, which occupations earn more than others or less than others, how the overall structure of pay should be established. This is a method for doing that. We're not going to spend too much time on that because we would need a whole course on compensation to really get our arms around that process. And the general supervisor of whatever occupation is not going to do this. This is something that you would hire a consultant or a professor to help with. So you would hire people that have done this a number of times and know, quite familiar with this process. There are companies that don't like this model. It takes quite a bit of time, and there's quite a fair amount of administration to it. So the setup is rather cumbersome to begin with. Maintaining it once it's set up isn't too bad. There's a lot of more newer entrepreneurial companies that aren't going to use this method, so they'll use market-based pay, where they pretty much look at, for this skill set this person has, for this occupation, what's the relevant labor market, what do people in this occupation or with this skill set earn in this labor market, and that's the pay that they assign. I think some of the problem arises in establishing the relationships among pay, and then the pay ranges are a little trickier when you just kind of use market pay. When do you cap off somebody's pay? But again, you can use the market to inform these decisions. So I think a lot has been learned about how to use this market-based pay that isn't as bureaucratic and structured as a traditional job-based compensation model. So whichever model you go with, look at some of the best practices and make sure that your organization is implementing and following some of those best practices for maintaining perceptions of equity, maintaining the ability to motivate and retain employees. I'd like to spend a little bit of time on the supervisor's role. So the supervisor, what do you think is the supervisor's role regarding pay and incentive systems? I think do's and don'ts. I think it would be important for a supervisor to know things they should do and not do related to pay. And I've had to solve some headaches related to managers who didn't have real good sense about the do's and don'ts related to pay. So first one that comes to mind is not making promises, particularly to interviewees or to employees. So things like promising a certain level of pay, or promising you'll get a pay increase after X amount of months on the job here, or promising a promotion and a pay increase. Those things can cause immense headaches. These things can be granted when they are due, but supervisors should do a lot of homework and a lot of checking with the authorities and the cognizant managers in their organization before they talk about any pay outcomes with employees. Because even if you're not promising, but you're saying something is a possibility, there's a percentage of employees that will hear that as a promise. And I think we've talked about the psychological contract. When these expectations that employees have are not met, it can have severe consequences for trust and motivation. So we have to be extremely careful in the pay arena. It's just a very dangerous area to talk loosely about pay outcomes. So not making promises would be extremely important. Checking everything with multiple levels, dotting every I, crossing every T, being overly careful if anything related to pay would be important for supervisors. I think also upgrading one's skills and being able to answer basic questions confidently regarding pay. So a supervisor needs to understand how pay levels are set for his or her employees, how the pay structures work in the organization, how pay increases are earned, things like that, basic questions that could be answered. So that's going to take some self-efficacy. I've heard stories of supervisors who are too nervous to answer these questions, and certainly if a boss is too nervous about the pay arena and the structures and how decisions are made, the boss should not answer those questions. But I think in the long run, a boss should become high self-efficacy or confident and knowledgeable and able to answer these basic questions, at least for his or her immediate employees. The trickier questions always should be referred to the expert who can authoritatively answer that question. So know when not to answer questions and when to seek more information would be another key area. So when in doubt, say, can't answer that, I think that's a good question or an important question, I'll check it out and get back to you, and then certainly check it out thoroughly and follow up with the employee. But don't have to answer every question on the spot. In fact, I don't think most employees expect that. They will expect some follow-up. If you say you're going to check on it for them, they will expect you to do so. That will be quite important. I think one of the key messages I'd like to get across is that pay and pay raises should reflect performance. This is an area where a lot of companies fall short. So it's quite important. A typical problem is that there's not enough differentiation in pay or pay raises or bonuses between kind of mediocre performers and good performers. There needs to be more of a differentiation or a discrepancy in the pay raises that are given. I think otherwise the message to the top performers is that, hey, I can work really hard and try to do all these great things for the company, but the percentage increase that I receive isn't a whole lot different from that coworker over there that really doesn't do a lot extra for the company. It's a little bit demotivating. It would return to a perception of inequity. So our job isn't to make everybody happy. Our job is to use pay to motivate. And I think the typical mistake is not to have a big enough spread that matches performance. So if you've got a top performer, they need a top pay increase. If you've got a poor performer, maybe they don't get any increase. Do we want to keep that person around? Do we want to reward poor performance? No. I think a model I've seen a lot would say that you're kind of average employee that you don't want to lose, but they're not a real good performer. They're just more or less an okay performer, does the job, nothing extra. Basic rule of thumb would be if you can keep them equal with cost of living, that's fine. If they drop below an okay, acceptable level of performance, I think you want that cost of living to be eating away at their pay so that they'll either be motivated to improve their performance or find employment elsewhere. That's my personal philosophy. It may not be yours, and it may not be right for some cultures. But certainly we want the top performers that really make a difference for the company to feel that their contribution is recognized and that they are paid fairly. There are sometimes in pay unintended inequities. I've done some research in organizations, well-managed organizations, and found sometimes that pay hid some unintended consequences, like maybe lower starting salaries for women, maybe larger percentage increases for women but lower starting salaries. And these kind of things can be problematic because they may show some kind of bias that again is unintentional but is a problem. So we're looking for equity and fairness, and there are statistical methods that can be used to correlate, for example, starting salaries or bonuses or pay increases with things like gender, minority status, maybe age. To look for some of these correlations, there may be good reasons for correlations if they're discovered, or there may be troubling, there may not be a good reason for those correlations, but it would be good to find out about those before there's some sort of problem, certainly before there's a lawsuit and we're in front of a judge trying to explain these discrepancies or negative correlations before a prosecuting attorney. So it might consider hiring a consultant from time to time to come in and look at the pay structure, look for inequities, put on the prosecuting attorney hat, maybe do some statistical analysis for us so that we can find these things before someone else does. I'd like to talk a little bit about profit sharing, gain sharing, and bonuses. Have you experienced profit sharing? I've worked at one company that did, Ford, and I certainly enjoyed profit sharing. When I was working there, we were making good profits and got some pretty nice size, some pretty healthy size profit sharing checks, and those were always very happy days in the workplace. You definitely had a different affect, to use a psychological term, or a different mood on profit sharing payout days. So definitely can create some positive mood. I guess I'll be kind of a Grinch on profit sharing. I won't say that it's something that should be ruled out or totally never used, but I'm not a big proponent of profit sharing. While I certainly enjoyed receiving profit sharing checks, I don't think they have a real big motivational impact. If it's a good sized company, maybe in a very small sized company it could, but in a bigger company, I don't see that there's a whole lot of connection between what I do as an individual employee and that profit, right? So the top management decisions, the organizational strategy, the global economy, the interest rates, the things happening in my country, all of those things combine to have big effects on the profit and me as an individual employee. Unless I'm the CEO or pretty high in the organization, I may not feel that I have a lot of control over that. I think the counter argument people would say is no, profit sharing does. It focuses employees on the fact that profits are important, focuses them on ways to reduce costs. And again, I think it can do a bit of that, and it probably does more of that the smaller the organization. So I wouldn't totally rule it out, but I'm a bit skeptical about the long-term motivating power of profit sharing. In fact, it's tricky to implement any pay or incentive system that has a long-term desired motivational effect. So maybe there's better ways to spend the money, but if you differ, you may be able to utilize profit sharing effectively. I wouldn't, again, rule it out. I like gain sharing more, but gain sharing won't work in a lot of companies. Gain sharing will work in a company where there's good trust between employees and management, and where there are opportunities for employees to help produce gains, productivity gains, or cut costs. So gain sharing, to explain it simply, is setting up a system whereby you ask employees look for ways to cut costs, improve productivity, and then you have a pre-agreed upon set up structure where a percentage of those savings are returned to employees and a percent goes to the company. So employees, help us reduce costs. We'll measure those savings, those productivity increases. We'll crunch the numbers, find out how much the money was. You get a percent of that, and the company gets a percent. I think that can work well. Again, the culture has to be right for that, but it certainly focuses employees on looking for ways to be more efficient. I think bonuses are especially powerful. There's all kinds of bonuses. There's even spot bonuses. Spot bonuses when an employee does some extraordinarily good work that you can kind of give a more or less surprise bonus. You want it big enough to have an effect. And so it would be kind of an out-of-the-blue, unexpected bonus. Because of what you did, that was exemplary performance that helped the company and did save that customer, we want to thank you. So it'd be kind of it has a lot of symbolic motivation. Maybe the boss shows up, so a lot of appreciation, thanking the employee for what they did, handshaking. It doesn't have to be a public event. Maybe the top manager at the site is the one that presents the spot bonus. So these things can show quite a bit of appreciation. Even the symbolic value may outweigh the monetary value. But there's ways to build bonuses into the pay structure. In fact, many companies nowadays are moving away from the situation where the pay is based more on base salary. They're moving more to the setup where the pay is variable. So if the company does well, you do well. If the company doesn't do so well in terms of profit or revenue, you don't do as well as an individual employee. So bonuses can help focus employee attention on the company's outcomes, focus me very much on the things that the company wants me to do. I know there was a situation where one of the aircraft producers had a big contract, an extremely multi-millions of dollars or more for Saudi Arabia. They were building some planes for the Saudis, and they were behind their timeline. It was very shaky whether or not they were going to be able to make their contract and deliver these planes on time. So it was a big issue for the company's reputation and profitability. So they were kind of in desperate measures. They offered some extremely large bonuses to employees. I think they were offering up to about 40% of an employee's base salary. And these employees working for the aircraft industry already earn pretty good money. So think about your current salary and then the potential in this 1 year to earn an additional 40% of that. That would get my attention, and indeed it did get the attention of the employees for this company. The result was that employees completely mobilized to help the organization meet this contractual obligation. Employees were practically sleeping in the plant. They were working fanatically to get this order met, and indeed the order was met, and the company was very happy to pay these extremely large bonuses because it had the intended result. So I think it's important to keep in mind that bonuses are an extremely potentially powerful motivational technique. I think the problem is a lot of times that pay raises or bonuses aren't big enough to really motivate. I wonder if you've heard of the concept of the just noticeable difference, JND. I think some of the psychologists call it as an acronym, the just noticeable difference. So what would the pay increase have to be just barely noticeable to an employee? So in other words, an employee has a base salary, they get a paycheck every month. Say for instance, for this hypothetical example, that you didn't tell an employee they were getting a pay increase, and the next month you implemented the pay increase without telling the employee. How big a percent would that increase have to be before the employee would notice it? Just barely big enough to be noticeable. So we're thinking of the smallest percent. Think about that for a moment. What's the smallest percent that an employee would be likely to notice in that next paycheck? This certainly isn't a research area that we've done it's too arcane, too micro an area to have received much research. But I've seen a couple studies, I think they were like 20 years apart. 7% is the figure in both studies. There was a range of like in one study, and the other just came right out and said it was around 7%. And that seems plausible, has some face validity to me. It seems believable. So think about this. What is the average, even in pretty good economic years, what is the average pay increase of merit pay systems? Historically, from what I've seen, it's usually 5-point-something%. In recent years, it's been very low. In fact, there's been a lot of years where no pay increases have been given. But so even in pretty good years, the average merit increase in a merit pay system has been below the amount to be even just noticeable. So there's some managers and researchers that say that a pay increase really needs to be 10%, maybe even 12-14% to have any motivating power. And so we kind of need to think through, are the bonuses, are the pay increases we're granting going to have the desired effect? Now I think if you don't grant any increases because, well, we can't reach those thresholds that will be meaningful or noticeable, so we just won't give anything, that might be appropriate at times. But employees also can become distressed over cost of living eating away at their real income over time. And again, if they see that they're slipping by as compared to those external equity, the comparison persons that they have, that can be a problematic too. But certainly I think that goes back to my argument. If we can preserve some of our merit increase budget or our reward budget by not rewarding poor performers and have more to reward for top performers, that certainly would be worthwhile. I think that concludes this chapter, and I hope some of these concepts will be useful to you to motivate your employees using both non-financial rewards and financial rewards.